the precise way to create images and videos in Unreal Engine, where you get the most control, is to use a specific camera object instead of just using the viewport as we're doing here with the bookmarks that we set up in the last video, which is very handy and very fast. But to get control when you're really setting up a scene or a specific view is to work with cameras. There's a few different ways we can add a camera. We can either go, as we have done before, to the quick add to the project button. Under cinematics, we have something called Cine Camera Actor. We can click on it or drag it, and you can see that when we drag it in, a few things happen. One, we can see actually a 3D model of a camera here, which means we can see the direction that it's pointing at. And we can also see in this little window that pops up what that camera is seeing. So we can begin to rotate it and change the settings. So for instance, you can rotate it just like any object by using the button up here or E on your keyboard to get up the rotation. And as I rotate it, you'll see that the little window down there also gets adjusted. Let's say we want it to look straight down one of these arches, one of these windows. And let's say like we look at this and we see it's not perfectly lining up. We could move it back and forth until we get the precise location. But in this case, we can actually be very precise, because if we click on this object, we can see that the gizmo here is in the center of the object. So we can copy these coordinates. We go to transform, and we have that doorway selected there, and we right click on the transform location, copy, and then we go to our camera, and under general we have the location and we paste. This is going to move the camera down to the ground, but it's going to align it with the doorway exactly. So we can see that. So now we can move it up again, move it back to where we want it to be looking, and let's say it seems to align pretty well, and that looks pretty nice. Obviously, depending on how you're setting up the camera, like if you play around with the rotation, maybe it's quite simple that you end up with something like this. You rotate it in more than one direction at the same time, and you end up with something where you're kind of lost and you don't know how to get it back. Again, you can always go and change the default of the rotation. You can always go back to the default values by clicking this arrow, or again you can type in the 0 values here to get it back to where it was. So I'm going to rotate it again, put it back where I want it to be. Let's say we can create some other kind of effects for this specific image. Let's say we add some point lights here, maybe 2 or 3 of them, and we change the strength, we change the color as well to create some interesting effects, maybe 3, and then we make a copy of one of them, we put it much further back, and we change the color of this too. And now for some extra effects, we can go up to directional lighting and turn that off. And all the other lights turns off, and we can now, if we click on the camera, see we get maybe some interesting effects. So as you can imagine, like this camera basically has its own settings that just applies to what this one camera sees. And we're going to look at a few of these different settings that, like all other settings, appear in the detail panel. So we have again the location and rotation, etc. Then if we go to camera options, we have a few different things about aspect ratio, etc. And then under current camera settings, here we can see that we actually get maybe quite similar settings that you get in an actual physical camera. You can change a few different default ones. So we keep an eye on the little window down there, and we change to a Super 8 camera. We see that both the zoom and the aspect ratio changed. Or we can try like an IMAX camera or something like that. And then all of these other settings changes accordingly to that camera. So we can keep that as a default and then keep changing things. So first we have the sensor width and height. So if you change that, you'll see that the aspect ratio of the image will change. So if you want something, let's say we want something vertical, this is also an interesting way to kind of crop and fixate on, like, the higher the number, the wider the field of view, as you can see. Like, this is getting to a level where we can see where the camera is, and basically that bit of ceiling is this here. So if you go to extreme with these values, you'll start to kind of mess up with the perspective of the camera. Then if we go down to lens settings, we have focal length here, and we have a few other settings like f-stop. We won't go into too much detail about this. Then we also have the focus settings. So you can see here, and actually at this point maybe I should also say that, you know, this is not the only way to look at the camera. This is, you know, quite small. We can now, when we added the camera, we can go up to this perspective button and change from perspective to the camera that we just created. So we click that. Now the whole view is filled up by the view from this camera. And this is described as that we're piloting the camera, which means that whatever we do here will update the camera settings. So if we go back to general and look at these location values here, if I now move around the camera, you see that these settings are updated. And if I exit the camera, which I can do with this button there, or I can go back to perspective view, and we look at where the camera is, now the camera has both moved in all different ways, which is not what we want. So I'm going to undo to get it back to where it was and go back to this view. So be careful and make sure that when you're piloting the camera, you're not moving around. Go back to the camera settings and look at this focus settings. So it's set to manual, and this manual focus distance has a little eye drop. And if we click that and click somewhere in our scene, you'll see that the focus changes, so that we can create some really kind of interesting effects with this, very cinematic effects. You can see now here that the first frame that we're right in front of is in focus. Let's see if we maybe put in some object here so we get an extra interesting view of this. Let's see what else we imported. Maybe we take this one here. Let me scale it down. I'm gonna go here instead and do it and type in 0.1. So now we have this funny little door detail here. If we go back to our camera now, focus on that, you can see that we can create a lot of dramatic effects. And also, if you feel like it's not quite strong enough, then just like in any camera, you need to go in and change the settings for the aperture. So if we change this, you'll see that the effect of the basically how small the area of focus is, and so the smaller it is, the more extreme the focus distance is. So if we to 1.2, if we go up to 20, you can see that now our focus distance is much greater. And of course you can always go back and disable this, and now everything is in focus. We're gonna bring it back again because we quite like this effect that it gives. There's also under the crop settings at the bottom the focal length for the camera. So you can keep the sensor, basically the aspect ratio, and here zoom out or zoom in to create interesting effects. And also one important thing to note here is that Unreal Engine by itself cannot really do parallel projection really well. So in order to kind of simulate that, you can use this to bring it into a very, very high number. 1000 I think is the highest value, to create those sort of effects. Then on the camera here there's a bunch of different settings, similar to the post-processing volume. It basically has its own post-processing volume, so we can here go and add different kinds of effects like bloom or other kinds of camera effects, saturations, etc., that only affect this camera. Then now how to export this, we can either go to the high resolution screenshot. The only downside of this, if we click capture and we look at that image, is that it has this nice cropping, but if we open it in Photoshop, I think you will see that the cropping of the image, actually it did seem to work. Okay, I'll take that back. It crops the image according to the sensor size that we set. So I'm just going to drag it into Photoshop to make sure that I know what I'm talking about. Yes. So there we go. So with this you can get really, really far, because now we can stop piloting this camera, and let's say we were quite happy with that, but we want also a different kind of effects. Then we can make a copy of this camera, and let's say we want to look in a slightly different angle, maybe have a slightly different ratio. Maybe this is an interesting view. And we pilot it again. And you can see now that we have camera 2. We can also go ahead and change the name of them to keep track of which one we are working with. And if we open that one, then now we can change the sensor height, etc., and maybe have slightly different effects. And you can have any number of different cameras. So basically different render settings, you can copy them in the same place and experiment and copy it again, so you don't mess up the settings of the first one. And to do a kind of final export of an image, I would suggest that you, in the high resolution screenshot, you go and start with 1, and then you can gradually increase it. So then go to 2 and 3 and 4 and 5, etc. If we try with 5, it might crash, which happens sometimes, which means that we should save before. So this might take anything between 10 to 15 to 20 seconds. If it takes more than a minute, we can see here that it finished. We can go ahead and look at it in the folder. Now we have an 80 megabyte image. If we open it and zoom in on one of the areas that are in focus, you can see that we have an extremely high resolution image.